5746, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act.
And the question is on the motion to proceed to the motion to reconsider.
Mr. President, I make a point of order that for this message from the House, with respect to H.R. 5746, the only debate in order during consideration of the message be on the question of adoption of the motion to concur in the amendment of the House. Further, that no amendments, motions, or points of order be in order, and that any appeals be determined without debate.
Following the rules of the Senate, the point of order is not sustained as it is a compound motion that would require consent.
Mr. President, I appeal the ruling of the chair.
The question is, shall the ruling of the chair stand as the decision of the Senate?
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be, and there is, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Bennett. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Booker. No. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Braun. Aye. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Burr. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Cappuccio. Aye. Mr. Cardin. No. Mr. Carper. No. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Coons. No. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. No. Mr. Cotton. Aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crabo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Mr. Haggerty. Aye. Ms. Hassan. No. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. No. Mr. Hickenlooper. No. Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Mr. Kane. No. Mr. Kelly. No. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. King. No. Ms. Klobuchar. No. Mr. Lankford. Aye. Mr. Leahy. No. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Markey. No. Mr. Marshall. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Manchin, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sinema, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Wicker, Young. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The decision of the chair stands as a judgment of the Senate. There will be order. Senate will be in order. The majority leader.
Mr. President, I withdraw the motion to proceed to the motion to reconsider the failed cloture vote.
The motion was withdrawn.
Now, for the information of the Senate, there will be no further roll call votes tonight. Senators should expect a roll call vote at noon tomorrow on the confirmation of Holly Thomas to be the U.S. Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit. And, Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
It won't be soon, unless you want.